That the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
No. Be afraid. Be very afraid.
There is nothing to fear except God. Whatever that means to you.
Do I look like someone who cares what God thinks?
You're listening to The Fear of God, a podcast exploring the intersection between Christianity and the horror genre. Hello and welcome to The Fear of God, Episode 7. We're having a conversation on this show about Christianity and the horror genre and the intersection there. And having this conversation are two people. Myself, I am Reed Lackey.
And Nathan Rouse here.
And what we want to do for the next few weeks is something a little special. As you're listening to this, this is October, which of course is a very special month for horror fans. Halloween is quickly on the horizon. And what we wanted to do, potentially as a recurring thing, maybe every October or maybe just periodically, or I don't know, maybe this will be the only time we do something like this. We wanted to take the next few weeks and kind of focus in on one particular filmmaker as an individual, kind of do a deeper dive into the work of one very specific filmmaker who I am very, very fond of. And I'm sure many fans of the horror genre are also very familiar with him and very fond of him. Or maybe, like my good friend Nathan, you have only seen prior to this, maybe one or two of his films. So before we get into all that, Nathan, how you doing?
I'm doing well, man. I got to admit, my cultural palate has been stuffed to overflowing with some pretty scary stuff lately, but
you're welcome.
Yeah, but otherwise I'm doing well. You know, typically listeners probably won't know or care, but typically we do these podcasts recording in the evening, and right now it's fresh and early, especially for you. And
oh yes,
so I'm doing well. I'm feeling on top of the day. But I gotta ask, Reed, how the fog are you? You like that?
That's terribly impressive, and don't do it again. Yeah, no, doing pretty good. As you said, it's pretty early in the morning for me, but I'm very, very excited to dive into what we're talking about today. And given that we actually have quite a bit of ground to cover. So what we're going to do, we're going to take a few minutes here, and for those of you who are listening and are like, who in the world are they talking about? We are going to be spending the next few weeks talking about the work of, I consider him legendary, filmmaker John Carpenter.
I'm going to jump in here, Reed. I think it's important to note that in this ongoing conversation of Christianity and horror, that we might have picked the most Christian of them. I mean, the guy's name, his initials are JC, you know, and his last name is Carpenter. I mean, you don't get a more righteous vocation than that. So I don't know. I think you chose wisely, and you know, the gospel just reeks off of his material. And I think we're gonna, you know, especially our third installment. But I'm sure you'll get to where we're going with all this.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, and I'm sure if he's never going to listen to this, but I'm sure that if he did and heard those references, he would definitely. I don't know about be offended. He'd probably lose his lunch, whatever it was. But it's interesting that you say that, though, because I'm a big believer that religious themes and sometimes religious thoughts can often be subtextual for even filmmakers and artists who would consider themselves to be completely a-religious. But he's definitely one who has been open about the fact that religion in some variation is present in a lot of his films, not because he himself is a religious person. I think he's actually a very outspoken non-religious person. But he's said in several interviews before that either a religious character or a religious theme is prominent in a lot of his work. And I think, honestly, when I'm coming right down to it, the biggest reason I wanted to profile him first has to do with the fact, two things. First of all, he's one of my very favorite directors ever, not just in the horror genre. He's just one of my favorites. And then also he made a film that we're going to be talking about in a few weeks. And I wanted to spend our first Halloween here on The Fear of God talking about Halloween. So, that was, largely the reason why we're doing this sort of deep dive. But what we're going to do.
Well, let me ask you, Reed. I'm going to jump in again as I'm wont to do.
Sure.
I know you've got some specific sort of profile material to hash through, but I'm curious from your experience. I had seen Halloween before about 15 years ago, but that was the only of the movies we're going to be talking about that I had seen previous. Harkening back to our pilot episode when you talked about seeing, Freddy Krueger at 2.5. That's a bit of an overstatement. But what was your initial experience with John Carpenter?
I believe that the first John Carpenter film I saw was in fact Halloween. I'm embarrassed to say that I'm not actually quite sure how young I was when I saw it, but I know it was early.
You're not sure, or you're embarrassed to admit?
No, it was definitely, you know what? Probably both. We'll just say both. It was young. It was on the younger side. I'm sure I saw it, as an adolescent, 9 or 10, but I'm actually not quite sure. Unlike some of the other films that I have a very specific memory of where I saw it and where I was and how old I was, that's not the case with Halloween specifically. I do know though that Halloween was the first John Carpenter film I saw.
Gotcha.
And then I went on to see probably They Live next. I think I was a little late coming to The Thing, although that is definitely a favorite.
That's probably good and healthy for you to be late to that.
to be at least a teenager is probably wise. Right. But yeah, I mean, I think maybe like a lot of people, it wasn't until I was approaching my late teens, early 20s that I really began to realize, you know what, this guy's a favorite of mine. He's responsible for a lot of films that I really enjoy, that I really love, and then sort of started doing a more focused look at his filmography and a more focused look at the kinds of things that I responded to in his films. So Halloween was definitely kicked the door down, as it did for a lot of people. That was the one that got me started in his work. It's my 10th favorite film of all time, not just in the horror genre.
That's very specific.
You've known me for a long time, but I don't know that I have shared with you, and we don't need to divert to this because it will take a lot of time. But I am very, very fond of list making.
I know you are. I just want to make sure the listeners are aware that it's okay if they aren't 100% sure what their 10th favorite of all time is, genre or otherwise.
Exactly.
But I applaud your specificity.
Well, and it changes every year,
Of course it does.
A couple of years ago, Halloween ranked at number 11. It cracked the top 10.
So it's climbed up. It's climbed.
It has. Yeah, it has. And who knows?
Maybe who knows what 2017 will hold?
Exactly. Maybe we'll find it up there at number 6 or 4. Who knows? Maybe it'll drop back down to 42. That's doubtful. But so how these episodes are kind of going to go, and this is our first time doing this, but how these episodes are going to go is I want to spend the next few minutes just kind of looking at sort of a broad stroke of the first decade of his work, touching on the films that he made there and a couple of trivial highlights here and there. Feel free to jump in if you have any trivial highlights I don't touch on.
Do they have to be related to John Carpenter? Or just trivial highlights?
I'd prefer it. Instead of like, hey, did you know that when you...
Right.
But what we'll do is, after those first 10 or 15 minutes, we're going to do a more intensive look at one of his films specifically. As you alluded to earlier, we're going to be looking at his film, The Fog, in a more in-depth basis. But first thing I want to do is just kind of look at the first sort of decade of his work to begin with. So listeners, we're going to dive right in and going to introduce you in broad strokes to the work of John Carpenter. Nathan, you ready?
I'm buckled up.
All right. Okay. So, I'm just going to kind of rattle off sort of an audio biography here. Carpenter was born in Carthage, New York, January 16th, 1948. He was the son of a music professor, and fans of his films will know that he's also noted for composing a lot of the music in his films. He's said that his biggest influence in filmmaking is a combination of like the classic westerns, like John Wayne and John Ford westerns, and low-budget science fiction and horror films. And as we'll see in a couple of his films, he actually combines the qualities of both of those genres a few times into sort of an odd amalgam that gives him a unique style. He went to film school at the University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts. And it's interesting because he was a part of a short film called The Resurrection of Bronco Billy. Now, he didn't direct that short film, but he did co-write it, edit it, and compose the music for it. And that went on to win the Academy Award in 1970 for Best Live Action Short Film. So watch the Oscars, those short films. You never know what names are going to crop up there every year. But while he was in film school, he had directed his first feature, which wasn't actually begun as with the intention of releasing it theatrically. But he directed a film called Dark Star, which he had co-written with his buddy at the time, Dan O'Bannon. Now, Dan O'Bannon may be noteworthy to science fiction and horror fans because for Dan O'Bannon's work on Dark Star, he was actually eyed by one George Lucas and was commissioned to come help with Star Wars on the special effects specifically. But more so for the horror genre, Dan O'Bannon is noteworthy because actually using some inspiration from Dark Star, Dan O'Bannon went on to write Alien, which is kind of his claim to fame. But Carpenter directed Dark Star for a measly $60,000. And, you know, obviously I don't have $60,000 sitting in my bank account, but
if you did, you could make Dark Star.
I could make Dark Star too,
in
you know, maybe
1973 or whenever that was.
Exactly. Something to aspire to. It's interesting because if you watch that film, it is something that's fascinating to see because he does so much with a limited budget. And we're going to talk in a little bit about how that's kind of become a trademark for him, is how much he can do with very little money. It's only like an hour long. It's like 68 minutes. So he directed this and it started running the little student film circuits, but there was a producer named Jack Harris who saw it and liked it. Not only did he buy the distribution rights, but he also financed to have an extra like 15 minutes put into it so that it could be released theatrically. And so they did that. That's like every student filmmaker's dream. You just, hey, this guy wants to buy my student film and release it. But the problem was, when they released it, they billed it as like this serious science fiction piece, and it's really more of sort of a dark comedy. So, as we'll discover with many of John Carpenter's films, it was actually initially a failure, in the box office. People didn't quite get it. And John Carpenter has famously said that he is not fond of the theatrical cut of it. As he put it, he said they took a really good looking student film and turned it into a pretty crappy looking feature film just because they tried to add in this extra footage for padding and everything. So when he got the opportunity later to re-edit it, the director's cut of that takes out all of that extra footage and cuts it all down. And if you were to go get the DVD today, the version, I think actually both versions are available on DVD and are distinguished from each other. But the version that I saw was his original student film. I think it's actually pretty clever for what it is. It's painfully dated, of course, and it's a student film. But it's actually surprisingly funny, and it has got a pretty great ending that kind of depends on the work of a Ray Bradbury short story. So Dark Star is, for any Carpenter fan, is a curious and possibly worth your time examination. It's not essential, but it's worth checking out if you're really curious about doing a deeper dive into his work. But out of Dark Star, he was then asked to make, in the 70s, there's lots of exploitation films being made, and Carpenter was commissioned to basically, hey, we want you to make an action exploitation film. You've got $100,000. Can you do it? So what Carpenter did was he took a script that he had, which combined his love for westerns and horror, specifically the classic western Rio Bravo and the classic horror Night of the Living Dead. He had a script that sort of combined the elements of those films into a different modern setting, and he took that budget, took that script, and made Assault on Precinct 13. So that is considered by Carpenter to be sort of his first official film. It's considered that way by most of his fans too. And it's a really good movie. It was very poorly received at the time. You're going to hear me say that a lot for his films, but it was very poorly received at the time. And the biggest reason for that had to do, ironically, with its violence. I say ironically because today seems like that's something that American audiences tend to be a bit desensitized to. Sure. And tend to not care so much about how intense the violence in some films or TV shows get. But Assault on Precinct 13 is a pretty violent movie. It would actually probably be considered tame by today's standards. But what's interesting is that one particular director, or one particular voice in the critical world, George Romero, who had directed Night of the Living Dead, he loved Assault on Precinct 13 and famously praised it publicly. But it also overseas, specifically in London, but in most of the European territories, it received a lot of praise. So even though American audiences hated it, Carpenter was kind of earning himself a global reputation.
Well, and I'm going to jump in and clarify for listeners. I mean, I'm sure we've got a broad spectrum of people who tune in, from your diehards who would be familiar with some of this, but also those who just love to hear our melodious voices. I mean, that name probably rings a bell for folks. I mean, there was a remake. You may have been getting to this, but just so before we move on from that specifically, I mean, there was a remake of this, 7-ish years ago, somewhere in there?
Yeah, 7 or 8 years ago.
With Ethan Hawke, right?
Yeah, Ethan Hawke and Lawrence Fishburne. We'll get to the remakes when we get later into his career, but I'm not fond of really any of the remakes. Even the Precinct 13 one? Yeah, the Precinct 13 one is good, and I'll just kind of leave it there. I wouldn't say it was even really good. It's definitely not great, but it is a good movie. Compared to the focus of the original, it does come up a little short, because I think the original actually has a great script. I think it's got really tight direction. Ironically, the original, given today's current social climate of police officers and racial tensions there, which we don't have to get into, it actually provides some sort of accidental social commentary on that. Mm-hmm. But I think the original is a great action film. I think it's considered one of the best action films of the 70s, and it's considered by many to be one of the best of John Carpenter's career. So the remake would have it'd kind of have an uphill battle trying to get into that in any capacity. But I'm actually very fond of Assault on Precinct 13. The first time I saw it, I didn't quite get it. But when I rewatched it for this profile, I responded very strongly to it in a positive way. Now, one thing I will say, for anybody interested in watching this film, and this is largely the reason American audiences rejected it, it is one of the few films to feature the on-screen murder of a child, specifically a little girl. And that was something that audiences responded very negatively to, at least in America. It's not graphically portrayed, particularly by today's standards, but it's still upsetting to watch.
Sure.
So that's something that is, it's a plot element. It's not gratuitous. It actually thrusts the main section of the plot into its proper place. But, it's a little upsetting. And Carpenter himself has said, in recent interviews that if he had it to do over again, he either would have filmed that scene differently or not shown that death at all. But at the time, he was a young, very sort of, I wouldn't call him reckless, but, a braver filmmaker and more willing to go into some dark places. But yeah, Assault on Precinct 13, if you're interested at all in John Carpenter, Assault on Precinct 13 is an essential work to check out. But moving on from there, he actually, I'll just touch on this briefly. He wrote a script for a film that would eventually become The Eyes of Laura Mars, starring Tommy Lee Jones and Faye Dunaway. Now, I didn't watch this one because other than writing the script, Carpenter didn't have anything to do with it, but it's worth noting if you're looking at the broad strokes of his career.
Well, I think that's like I think The Eyes of Laura Mars, I mean, that's like the prequel to the TV series Veronica Mars, isn't it? I mean, it doesn't...
Maybe. I would have to do my research on that one. But we'll go, you know what? I didn't do my research, so we'll go ahead and say you're right. We'll just do that. And we'll pick up next week with the fact check on that.
Sure.
But then right after that, his specific follow-up to Assault on Precinct 13 is the legendary landmark of his career. In 1978, he directed Halloween. And we're going to be talking in a few weeks more in depth about Halloween, so I'll save most of my thoughts on it for that episode. But it definitely kicked the door down for his career. It was, for a long time, the most successful independent film ever made. And it was, it legitimized the slasher genre as a profitable market and solidified John Carpenter as a director to watch. So again, we'll be talking more in depth about Halloween in a few weeks. But he followed up Halloween, ironically, I think, with two films that he made for television. The first of which was actually called Someone's Watching Me, that he wrote and directed. It is a pretty decent little suspense film. This is going to sound like a backhanded compliment, but if you are a fan of kind of the TV level suspense thrillers, they aren't too graphic, not too intense, but, provide some decent suspense here and there, then Someone's Watching Me is worth checking out. And it's also notable just because he wrote and directed it. It's got a pretty solid ending, but otherwise it's mostly just for the curious. Although it is worth noting that he met actress Adrienne Barbeau on the set of Someone's Watching Me. He would later marry her and cast her in a number of his films, including the main film we're talking about today. So after Someone's Watching Me, he made what I think is the oddest entry in his film career. And it's the last one we're going to talk about before we get into our main film. He made a biopic of Elvis Presley, simply called Elvis. And I don't know if this trivia is true, but it holds up in a couple of places where I did research. Evidently, he got the job to direct this film because the producers found out that he wrote the score for Halloween, and so they thought he could handle a biopic of Elvis.
That's funny.
Simply because he was into music. I know. And he directed this film. He didn't write the script, but he directed this film, and it stars Kurt Russell, who would become intrinsically linked with John Carpenter. He was kind of his muse. Carpenter and Russell would make a number of films together, and they met on the set of this biopic for Elvis.
So does Kurt Russell play Elvis?
Kurt Russell plays Elvis in an Emmy-nominated performance that I actually think is very, very good.
Interesting.
In fact, it's interesting because the film itself is very well directed and it looks great. They did a remastered DVD of it, and so the film looks great, but unfortunately, the script, which again Carpenter didn't write, is just very bland. Everything feels a little inevitable, even if you don't know much about the life of Elvis Presley. It's just sort of a paint-by-numbers sort of script. But it does have, as I said, good direction and some good performances, not only from Kurt Russell as Elvis, but also from Shirley Jones as Elvis's mother. But the other big thing is it is just a little too long. It's 3 hours long.
Wow. Well, come on. It's the king.
It's the king of rock and roll. You need to spend some time.
If he needs 3 hours, you give him 3 hours.
But yeah, again, if you're a fan of Elvis Presley and you want a biopic of Elvis Presley, you could do far worse than Carpenter's Elvis from 1979, particularly because Kurt Russell is very, very good in it. So it's worth watching almost for him. But for anybody else, who's interested in checking out Carpenter's work or anything like that, it's such an outlier to the rest of his work. And as I said, the script is not that impressive, and it's got a 3-hour runtime, so it's definitely for completists only in that regard. But after making those two films for TV, then he returned to the theater for the main film that we're talking about today, his follow-up to Halloween. Halloween was kind of a modern urban legend, if you will. So what he did was he returned to the horror genre in more of a classic campfire ghost story sort of format with 1980s The Fog. Now, Nathan, you had seen I know, I talked for a very long time and you're very patient.
You joke about Elvis's 3-hour runtime. I'm like, we're going to get there. We're going to beat him.
But you had not seen The Fog before I asked you to watch it for this, right?
No. And in fact, have you already mentioned the 4 movies that we are documenting, or are you keeping that a secret?
Yeah, I think I mentioned it in the preview for last week, so okay. It doesn't matter. Yeah, we can say what.
Well, yeah. So yeah, we're going to be looking at The Fog, They Live, The Thing, and Halloween. And honestly, the only Carpenter that I had seen Starman. I didn't know until after this experience that he was associated with that, but I have seen Starman.
Oh, okay.
But other than that, I had only seen Halloween. So I went into The Fog purely just knowing the title, which I don't know about you. Like, my wife gets annoyed with me sometimes because I'm the type of movie, or even just media consumer that, like, if I know I'm going to watch something, I actually prefer to know as little as possible. Like, so in this case,
Yeah, I'm the same way.
I didn't watch a trailer. I've got a friend who'll want to watch a trailer right before the movie. I'm like, why are you doing that? Like, you know, so no, I knew nothing about The Fog or They Live, or I had a loose association with The Thing, but we'll talk about that when we get there. But no, The Fog was,
okay.
I was foggy when it came to The Fog. I didn't know where it was going.
Well, listeners are about to roll their eyes at me, but of course, our show is called The Fear of God.
Oh, no. You don't stop.
The Fog.
Listeners and
I just figured I'd
co-hosts.
make everybody have a collective groan. I'm not editing that out either. That's staying in.
That's all right. That's all right.
But yeah, I mean, so what did you think? What did you think of The Fog in general impressions of it?
Well, you know, it's funny knowing where this series is going, especially for viewers who have seen these movies. I was going into this John Carpenter experience just having no idea what to expect. You know, I mean, I knew just the name, but didn't know a whole lot about what it was attached to, and just hadn't done the deep dive to know, you know, kind of what his landmark pieces were. And so literally it was, you gave me this list of movies and I was like, all right, I'm going to watch them. So with The Fog specifically, had no idea what to expect, was anticipating actually what I ended up getting with The Thing, but was anticipating just for no reason other than early 80s horror. And this is just what I thought was going to happen. Something more ghastly, something more kind of gory, that sort of thing. And I was pleasantly surprised by The Fog. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's pretty dated in its production value, but for not knowing what to expect and anticipating something with what we would sort of associate with like a harder R rating, I was genuinely sort of, this is going to sound like a dismissive word. I actually mean it complimentarily, if that's a word. But the Fog was very quaint.
Oh yeah.
It had this sort of, I mean, you used the word campfire. From that opening shot, that sets a lot of tone, right? I mean, you got
Absolutely.
an old man sitting around a campfire with kids. You kind of know, okay, well, this isn't going to get terribly ghoulish, just by the virtue of all these children here, or at least that was my thoughts seeing that scene.
Sure.
And I don't know. I thought it set the stage for this kind of almost storybook kind of feel, which it honors that feel.
Yeah, I agree.
I told you after watching it, this didn't come up in our pilot episode, but I was, as a teenager, a fan of the R.L. Stine stuff. This is long before Goosebumps was popular or even published, I think. But it had that kind of vibe to it, just the like curl up and read a kind of ghost story kind of feel. And so I don't know, I was really, really impressed with the tone. So yeah, I mean, there are other specifics I could hone in on, but in terms of your question of what did I think, that was sort of the answer to that.
Yeah, and I agree with everything you said. I think that it sets a really nice tone. I love that opening scene, which we'll have little bits of trivia here and there, but I think it's very interesting that original scene actually wasn't part of the film. It was something they had to add in later because they needed to beef up the running time a little bit. The first cut of the Fog, I think, ran at 75 or 78 minutes, and they needed it to cross at least the 80-minute mark, and they wanted it at an hour and a half. So he added a few other scenes.
Well, I'm going to jump in there. I know I get criticized for correcting you sometimes, and I'm not correcting so much as adding to. I did some digging on the Wikipedia page, and it actually, at least what it had to say, had less to do with runtime and more that he wasn't pleased with the edit. He wasn't pleased with the movie he had, so kind of went back, added that scene to, I imagine, as more of like a tone setter, added a couple other elements to make it a bit more cohesive. So yeah, I mean, that which is interesting, because if you eliminate that scene, I don't know that it dramatically changes the movie, but that scene is so good at setting a very specific tone that I think it would change your view on it, change the feeling associated with that movie.
I agree. And it's interesting to think about that there's a scene which really has nothing to do with the rest of the narrative and doesn't get called back to at any point during the narrative, but is so vital, as you said, and as I agree, that in setting the tone for the movie that you're about to see and the kind of thing that it is. Yeah, I love that opening campfire shot. I think it's very well written. It's well shot. And depending on how loud your TV is, that first watch click when it snaps shut might make you jump a little bit because the sound on it is elevated. It's a really great opener. And a couple of other interesting sort of trivia bits on this. So when recently I went back home to visit some family, and my nephew, like myself, is very, very fond of scary movies. And we had the opportunity to watch a scary movie, but we were going to be watching it with my niece and with my wife, both of whom have more tame sensitivities. And so we needed to select a film that was going to fit the bill for us in the creep factor, but not be so abrasive and so bombastic that it unnerved my niece and my wife. And we actually selected The Fog, which and I think it kind of fits that bill. If you're a fan of scary movies, but you don't like sort of the more intense, gruesome stuff that you tend to discover with scary movies, I think The Fog is a really great opportunity for you to see a genuinely good scary movie, but it's not so intense that it's going to really upset everybody. And that may sound to some people like a turnoff.
Well,
but.
And if I can jump in there, like you're identifying one of the main things I was pleasantly surprised by, especially going in with certain expectations, was one, I mean, just on a technical level, especially for 1980, is that what you said?
Yeah, 1980. Yeah.
It kind of does a lot with a little. I mean, the production design is a bit sparse for what it is, but I don't know. John Carpenter himself, and maybe ardent fans would look at it and say, well, you could have made the ghost pirate lepers, or whatever they are, a bit more gruesome and ghastly with a elevated effects budget. And yet, for me, watching this movie for the first time, I was actually kind of like, I like it because of that. I like it because, it's not gory. It's most of it is kind of in shadow. They're just these real sparse shots of these, sort of bandaged figures shrouded in darkness. I don't know. I just was really taken with that aesthetic in a way that was probably not intended, but I really responded well to.
Yeah, and you touched on something that is, we want to each episode kind of talk about some of the trademarks of his work, and you just touched on it, that he does a lot with a little. He's really known, even though he would later direct some films that had more robust budgets, he's known for taking smaller budgets and getting very, very creative with them. I think The Fog was made for only $1 million, which, again, I don't have $1 million, but when you consider most major feature films, that's pocket change.
I hope it becomes a trope of our podcast that whenever you throw out a dollar figure, regardless of the amount, you immediately follow it with, I don't have $10.
Exactly.
Will you please make a note to just make that part of your shtick? All
right, it's done. It's done. hashtag I don't have. But
there you go.
But yeah, he and not only is he known for sort of working with a modest budget, but he's also kind of got some economic storytelling style. Like he keeps things very simple and very confined. There's a couple of elements to the backstory that sort of bridge into some complications, but The Fog is a very straightforward, simple story. It's a very sort of classically styled ghost story, which I respond to still very positively because I love me a good ghost story.
I did think that in the conversation of how I responded favorably to something I didn't know I was going to get, I did maybe the flip side of that was it just made me chuckle, and I was like, was this what it was like to be an adult in 1980? I don't know, but it just really made me laugh that Jamie Lee Curtis is hitchhiking. Then is the character's name Nick? The actor, the character who picks her up. So she's hitchhiking. She gets, she's hitchhiking on this dark, deserted country road. She gets picked up by this stranger. In 2016, that's your premise for the scary movie right there. Instead, in 1980, she gets picked up by him. She gets in the car. They make some small talk. He is drinking and driving. She has no problem with that. then that scene ends with the car windows shattering because, the leper pirate ghosts are setting sail for Antonio Bay, I think was the name of the place.
Antonio Bay, yes.
Not to be confused with Antonio Banderas, which is a completely different place. So the windows smash and shatter, and then we leave that scene. Then there's a filler scene between there, and then literally the next time we see Jamie Lee Curtis and this other character, they're in bed together, clearly post-coitus, and to add to the just sort of mounting silliness associated with this thread of story, then one of them says something like, I didn't catch your name, and they kind of laugh it off and, and then share each other's names, and then they're besties for the next 36 hours. I mean,
it's true. It's true. That character's name, by the way, you were correct. That character's name is Nick.
Okay.
It is funny, sort of those sensibilities. I think that's largely a function of sort of the sensibilities of the 70s, more so than necessarily the 80s. Of course, this is at the onset of the 80s, but yeah, you're right. We're so insulated to those kinds of things that when you see them, it's like, oh, okay, so I guess this is not a problem now. But but you know what's funny about that? So obviously, Jamie Lee Curtis is the main character in Halloween,
right?
And we'll be referencing Halloween several times, so we'll talk more in depth in a couple of weeks. But Halloween actually wasn't her big break. After Halloween, she had a hard time finding work. I don't know if she had a single acting job for the 2 years following Halloween, which John Carpenter was stunned by because he thought her work in Halloween was so strong. So he recast her in that role in The Fog, and it was actually The Fog that became kind of her big break, because following that, people began to associate like, oh, she was in Halloween and she was in The Fog. So then she started getting lots of work in other scary movies. But I just thought that was really interesting. Which
is funny because I don't, personally, between The Fog and Halloween, I would say she's got a far more substantive role and more noticeable in Halloween than she does in The Fog.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I completely agree with you. But I just thought that was interesting.
I was going to say a few bullet points, just, some fun scenes in watching it, The Fog specifically. I kept waiting when the Ghost Leper Pirates, which is a great band name, by the way, somewhere out there, the Ghost Leper Pirates, especially with where I'm going with this comment, when they start descending on the Lighthouse radio station, and I just kept waiting for them to start spinning some discs, once she's left. I mean, that would just been a great 1980s movie moment that I mean, come on, if They Live can go where it goes in the middle of that movie, and we'll get there. You can totally have the Ghost Leper Pirates spinning some discs. But so that was good, or could have been awesome.
Wow.
On a more serious note, two scenes that I love is one, just the visual once the Ghost Leper Pirates, I'm going to keep using that phrase.
Oh yeah.
Are first shown en masse in the church. That was just a really great shot.
Oh, yes.
That really kind of evokes all it needs to with very little going on. That, and then also, maybe it was just in a movie with pretty standard cinematography and direction, this really stood out to me, the shot on top of the lighthouse. That was just a really well done.
Oh, yes.
Really well done moment.
Yeah, I would echo both.
Any other specific? Personally, I don't know, Reed, that I would say there was a whole lot of like quote unquote scary moments. I mean, I jumped a little bit when the windows exploded in the car, but
sure.
Other than that, although I should mention, I don't know if it's a scary moment as much as just an odd one when, doggone it, what's the adult actress's name that you?
Adrienne Barbeau.
You were. Okay, no, not her. The mayor lady.
Oh, Janet Leigh, actually. Which
yes, Janet Leigh. Well, when they're at the church and talking to Father Malone, or maybe they've gone back to see him, I don't know. But there's this odd scene where she walks to the front of the chapel, and in the background is just shadow, and then Hal Holbrook just sort of emerges out of the shadows. And,
yes.
It's just this odd little moment. Like, is he just chilling back there? I don't know. It was a little scary because of how weird it was.
I know. He's just sitting in the shadows watching everyone. Like, who's going to come in my church
waiting
now?
For somebody. That moment. It doesn't matter who it is. He's just waiting for somebody to walk to the front of the chapel.
Oh man. Well, one thing that's interesting to note, because we haven't said it yet, Janet Leigh is known to horror fans because she iconically met her demise in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. She's the victim in the famous shower scene. But also,
Spoiler alert.
Oh yeah, sorry, spoiler alert. But also of note is she is actually Jamie Lee Curtis's mother, which I thought was really interesting. They would make, I think this is correct. They would make 2 films together. They would make this one, and they also would team up again for Halloween H2O, which we'll reference in a few weeks. But yeah, I just thought it was very interesting that she not only is such an icon for horror fans everywhere, but also is Jamie Lee Curtis's mother. So when they're on screen together, particularly in that, climactic scene in the church, it always takes me out of the movie just a little bit to know that bit of trivia. But
Can I throw a random thought at you?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So this is less to do with the content of the movie and more just a diversion that you can shut down promptly, or we can engage for a minute or two. So in doing some research post watching the movie, like I said, I was digging through the Wikipedia page, and it's really interesting to note Carpenter's hindsight on The Fog just doesn't seem very positive. And you and I had a conversation about that's one reason the remake that you find abysmal, and it seems all of Rotten Tomatoes does as well, got greenlit as sort of he was because of his displeasure in the rear view with the initial The Fog. And so I was just thinking about the notion of self-awareness of filmmakers. We really don't have to spend much time talking about this, but this is, what are we in right now? We're the early August. I just saw a screening of Suicide Squad last night, which
I'm sorry.
My own personal views on were just that I maybe in a vacuum I might have enjoyed it a little bit. I just didn't get much viewing pleasure out of it. Harley Quinn's fantastic. If you want a big screen Harley Quinn, go check it out. Otherwise, I didn't find a whole lot to like about it. And then, of course, this morning I'm doing some browsing, and I see David Ayer, the director, using this new phrase that I've grown to hate about how he made it for the fans.
Oh.
And, and it's not my intention to sit here and bash Suicide Squad. I am making, however, a point about filmmaking in 2016 and filmmaking in 1980, and the self-awareness John Carpenter seemed to exhibit. Now, how closely to the release of this movie this began, I don't know. But we live in this interesting moment in filmmaking when it's not just a film.
Right.
It is very possible that David Ayer in private conversations says, man, dadgummit, I just really didn't quite get the movie I wanted out of this. Mm-hmm. But it will be years before that sort of thing ever gets made public, if it is the case, because it's not just Suicide Squad. You've got 10 movies, or, I'm not speaking specifically, but, you've got a decade's worth of franchise that needs to ride on these movies. Right. And so the money tied up in a single movie, much less an entire extended universe, is massive. And so it's just interesting to me to read someone like John Carpenter, who is not just niche, but is well-respected, well-regarded as a significant filmmaker, in those conversations, be able to speak very candidly. And again, how closely this was to the actual release of The Fog, I don't know. But, I just feel like that's a sorely lacking thing in our current sort of movie environment, is you just can't be honest because there's too much money involved.
Yeah.
To actually be able to say, I'm just really disappointed with how that went. What any thoughts on that specifically? Or
a few. I think I think you're absolutely right. I think that in today's sort of the postmodern climate of you have fans reacting to casting decisions on films, right. For performances that haven't even been delivered yet, let alone been seen. And that, there's a longer conversation to be had about this idea of, that maybe we'll have at some point, about fan entitlement and how that informs, the responses to certain films. But I think about one of the things that compels me about John Carpenter as a filmmaker is that for so much of his work, there are only maybe 3 or 4 films that he made that were highly praised at the time and are still highly praised. Halloween's one of them. Starman's another one. Escape from New York is probably another one. But a lot of his films, the reactions initially were very negative. And people could look at something like a Suicide Squad, or they could look at, filmmakers do sort of ride on that idea a lot that like, well, time will tell. There's a song, I forget by who, called Time the Revelator, that it just talks about this idea of, time is the one that really sort of says what the classics are and what's not. And,
sure.
The reappraisal of certain things. There are films that are wildly popular at the time that people just simply don't talk about anymore, that are not even in the cultural vernacular. And then there's other films that are either dismissed or ignored or outright despised at the time that later become, sort of cruxes for where culture goes. And I do think that it's difficult for any filmmaker to assess their own work on any basis other than okay, so I'll say this, and then we can maybe transition on. When a filmmaker says, well, we made this for the fans, to be honest, I think that is a bit of a cop-out. I was going to nuance my statement a little bit more, but I'm just going to go for it. I think that's a bit of a cop-out, because any filmmaker, I think, should, and I think Carpenter does this, they should make the film for them. They should make the film that they want to make. And I think that's the real sort of opportunity that they have to make a landmark film that will stand the test of time, is if they make the kind of film that they want to see. This idea of, well, we made this film for the fans or for the audience. And I don't know, maybe our listeners would disagree with me on this, but I think that kind of notion is dependent upon a reaction that is fickle, and it's dependent on something that only time is going to tell. Audiences could come and they may initially love this movie and then, in a few years just forget all about it. Or they may come and hate your movie. But years later, suddenly you'll begin to see emerge this idea of like, this film is great. This film is a masterpiece.
Right.
And I think the only way to counter that is for filmmakers or any artist, any creative artist, make the material you want to see made and keep that focus. I apologize for.
Well, I think, no, you're fine. I mean, because I want to give you high fives across the country here. I mean, like because I think ultimately a statement like made it for the fans is just dishonest.
Yeah.
There's, and, I'm going to come off as cynical as the day is long. I don't mean to, because I called you after I got out of Suicide Squad and passionately intoned, I want this stuff to be good. I don't go in desiring to come out sour.
Yeah.
But when it just reeks of sort of corporate art by committee, and then you've got Zack Snyder 6 months ago, I made it for the fans, or David Ayer today, I made it for the fans. Like, come on, man, just don't even say anything. Like,
yeah.
And I know there's a massive machine and all that sort of stuff, but I think there's something, you hit on something that I think is valuable, and that's make it for yourself, because at least that's honest, and at least that's true to what you're aiming for. And some of our favorite that you and I have talked about before. I mean, you just watched Midnight Special last night, Jeff Nichols.
Yeah.
That Joker makes movies for himself. He makes movies that he wants to be seen, but those are coming from about as honest a place as an artist as can be found. I'm just using the medium of film.
Yeah.
And also folks like, we would say, like a Damon Lindelof with Lost, they got such blowback for the end of that series. What did they do? They didn't say, well, we made it for y'all, the fans. We thought you'd like this. No, they said, we made the story we wanted to tell.
Exactly.
And I think there's just something real powerful as a viewer to be able to be like, because those are the artists you start to find, these people who speak to my sensibilities, as opposed to someone who just sort of patronizes me. Anyway, that's a whole diatribe, and we could clearly spend a lot of time talking about that.
Yeah, and I have a feeling that theme is probably gonna come up recurring as we talk more about some of Carpenter's later work, because as you said, and as this whole conversation started, like I think initially, wasn't totally happy with the end result of The Fog, and as you said, later signed off on the remake. Specifically because he wasn't quite happy with where it was. I have heard him say, in recent interviews that he does now consider it something of a horror classic and kind of its time, which I totally agree. And not to too dramatically transition here, but as we sort of eyeball winding down, one sort of other note that I think The Fog has as its element that I think shows up a lot in his work is something that's a bit more thematic. There's this idea in a lot of Carpenter's work of kind of penance or paying for something, not necessarily atonement, which I think is a different thing. Like atonement is, sort of more based on reconciliation and bringing things back together. But there's a lot in Carpenter's work about penalty or penance, like paying a price for something. And that's very present in the narrative of The Fog. We haven't really talked much about the specific plot. I'll just briefly say here, there's this small, isolated town called Antonio Bay, and the story is that while they are celebrating the founding of their town on its anniversary, it emerges that the town was actually founded on 6 people who had murdered this pirate and his band of pirates. The what did you call them? The rebel ghost pirates?
The ghost pirate lepers.
Ghost pirate lepers. There you go. That he had murdered them. This group of 6 people had murdered them and stolen their money, stolen their gold, and then used that gold to found their town and specifically to build the church. So the plot of The Fog is that these ghost pirate lepers are returning on the 100th anniversary. You're welcome.
You owe me $1.
I don't have $1 in my bank account.
Sorry.
That's okay. So these ghosts are returning to enact revenge on the descendants of these 6 people and to reclaim their gold. So what that made me think of specifically, in sort of a more specific vein than just the idea of penance in general, is, I think, I don't want to dive too deep into the cultural conversation about this, but I think there is an idea pervading several aspects of us as people, that says like we have to pay in some regard for the things that we did not have any control over, basically the sins of our fathers kind of thing, where like, things that happened, 100 years ago or a couple hundred years ago, or things, on a more personal level that our grandparents did or something like that, that we have to answer for, either culturally or socially, or sometimes financially and monetarily, that there has to be some sort of penance. And I thought it was just really interesting. Obviously, The Fog is a classical styled ghost story, but that idea is prevalent in the horror genre, the idea of coming back after, I'm going to reclaim what your father or your grandfather stole from me, and I'm going to reclaim it from you. And it's just an interesting idea because in most horror films, the person coming to enact that claim is actually the villain, or the monster is coming to sort of claim the penance, as it was. But I actually see it in several places culturally where we have this notion pervading over us that we have something to answer for, although we directly did not have any control over it. So what I wanted to kind of talk about as maybe sort of like a final touch point for our conversation is this idea of, should it be expected that we have something to answer for when we had no control over the transgression, we had no control over what went wrong? Is it just something that hangs over us? Do we think that that's just, I guess is my question, is do we think it's just that we necessarily have to answer for or do penance for something, even though we directly had no involvement with the transgression that took place? Do we think that that's a just idea, or is that a little unfair?
Well, I think the ghost pirate lepers would decisively declare that a just course of action.
Exactly.
As they do. I feel like this is just we'll probably continue to hit similar or find similar themes as we engage this material. As you were talking, I was just thinking of, from the Old Testament, the year of Jubilee, when all debts were forgiven. I believe it was the 7th year. And I think there's a scary notion in society to relinquish one's sense of reclaiming something that's due them. You know what I mean? Right. Like we feel entitled. We feel, gosh, I saw a news story, a couple weeks ago, where some woman was being held accountable for her son's school loans after he had passed away.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And just this, our culture, our American society right now is up to our ears in debt. And so that's a it's a timely conversation. But I don't know, for me personally, that's one of those things where forgiveness, mercy, justice, all of those things are deeply entwined. And I know I'd be pretty ticked off if some ghost pirate lepers showed up demanding something that my great-great-grandfather, did to them. Like, what up? I don't know. I have nothing to do with this.
Sure.
But I feel like that's, you made a joke, I think it was before we even started recording today, you made the comment of scripturally, the red letters, as we find in the New Testament, would sort of, and this is paraphrasing, sort of indicate you forgive everybody.
Yeah.
And,
yeah.
I mean, that even saying that out loud, I think of the 70 times 7 sort of guideline, like
how many times to forgive. Yeah.
Which isn't meant to be taken as strict math, is meant to be taken as metaphor, as, well, how many times does it require for you to forgive them? Well, you do that.
Yeah.
I certainly don't think this movie is necessarily trying to suggest that as much as it does evoke that conversation.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think the character that most sort of embodies this in a literal and a metaphorical way is Father Malone, because he's the one. Interesting, we didn't note this in trivia, but if you're watching The Fog for the first time, pay attention to the opening character of Bennett, the church worker in the very beginning, because that is John Carpenter. That's his cameo.
Interesting. Does he do that in every film?
Not every film. He does it occasionally, and very rarely as a speaking character, as he is in The Fog.
Because I think I recognized him as the Thing in The Thing. I mean, that was.
Yeah, well, he doesn't age well. But no, so getting back to the character of Father Malone, that's an interesting character to me, because the impetus of the main story, is that he discovers in the wall of this church building, this old diary that his grandfather left, about the founding of the town. And he discovers that golden cross was actually the gold of, the pirates who had come. So
the who?
The ghost pirate lepers. My apologies. So he discovers that that the gold was their gold, and that the church was kind of built on blood as much as it was on gold. And so he discovers that this is brand new information to him. Yet at the end of the film, in order to stop the tide of what's happening, he takes that, spoiler alerts for The Fog, but he takes that golden cross out to the pirates and, puts it forward and says, okay, I'm the sixth conspirator. Take me, take the gold and take me. And that is his effort to sort of appease and do penance for what, for the transgressions that have plagued this town and plagued the history of this town. So he offers himself up as sort of the compensation for this, in an effort to try to make things right. And I think it's very interesting, before we sort of explore that idea, possibly as a final note, that at first the ghost pirate lepers take the cross and go away, but then there's a final jump moment in this film where you think Father Malone is about to be off the hook, and that his noble sacrifice has actually ultimately saved him. And spoiler alert, that is not the case.
In fact, he was on the hook, if you will.
Whoa! Yes.
Nautical villains.
Yes, exactly.
Well, it's funny. It's funny you bring up that scene, because I remember right before it, as it's clear that the movie's winding down, thinking there's a surprisingly low body count in this movie. And then sure enough, Father Malone, Hal Holbrook, just sort of pondering out loud, but there were 6 or whatever it is he says.
Yeah, why didn't you
turns around and there's old Blackbeard himself.
Oh man, I know. And but I do think it's interesting, and kind of running short on time here, but I do think it's interesting, this idea, or this notion of, he says to the pirates, he says, I'm the sixth conspirator. But he's not. He's not the sixth conspirator. He is the grandson of the sixth conspirator, but that's not what he says. He says, I'm the one. And I do think it's notion, and I do think it's interesting, this notion that, somebody could step forward and not say, There's a phrase that I remember a lot, actually, as it pertains to my job, and then I try to express to people as my job, because a lot of times when something goes wrong at work, or if something goes wrong in life, like, you're constantly trying to find somebody to blame. I don't know where this phrase came from, but it's been very helpful to sort of wrapping my head around this idea. It said, it's not my fault, but it is my responsibility, which I think is interesting. It's an interesting notion. Like, okay, well, I'm not to blame for this, but it is my responsibility to sort of make amends, or to sort of pay penance. There's a passage of scripture that I think is very interesting. In Exodus, it talks a couple of times about, the guilty, the sins of one generation being passed on to even the third and fourth generation. But in Ezekiel chapter 18, verses 19 and 20, it says, "Yet you ask, why does the son not share the guilt of the father?" And says, "Since the son has done what is just and right and has been careful to keep all my decrees, he will surely live. The one who sins is the one who will die. The child will not share the guilt of the parent, nor will the parent share the guilt of the child. The righteousness of the righteous will be credited to them, and the wickedness of the wicked will be charged against them." That's the idea of, listen, you don't have to necessarily carry on your back the weight or the burden of things that you were not, that were not your fault. But I do think there is a powerful redemptive idea that says, even though this is not my fault, I will take responsibility for it. And which is, I think, of course, without getting too deep into it, listeners will know we're Christians. We believe that is the posture of Christ. This is not my fault, but I'll take responsibility for it. I'll pay for it. This is not my fault, but I'll take responsibility for it. And I think whether you feel that that's just or whether you feel that that's right, I think there's a definite redemptive note in it, and a powerful possibility for atonement in the notion of, this is not necessarily my fault, but I will take responsibility for it. Whether that be you're dealing with a friend, or a broken relationship in your family, or society and culture at large, or ghost pirate lepers. I think there's possibility in atonement and redemption by this notion of, it's not my fault, but it is my responsibility.
Sure. I think that's as good a place to any is to bring it home.
Sort of wrap up. Yeah. Well, we had
if the ushers will come down.
Exactly.
Go ahead and make that happen.
We'll pass the collection plate, because I don't have $1 in my bank account, and I don't have any ghost pirate gold crosses, to give to anybody.
I hope you don't, brother, because otherwise they're coming to get you.
Well, we hope you've enjoyed this conversation about John Carpenter, sort of beginning the conversation of John Carpenter at large, and most specifically about The Fog. Again, we'll be concentrating on that all through October. Next week, we're going to be looking specifically at the film They Live, and sort of the next decade in Carpenter's career. But as we say on every episode, the fear of God may be the beginning of wisdom, but it is not the end of the conversation. You can continue the conversation with us about any of the films we've discussed, particularly The Fog, or John Carpenter at large. You can do that in a number of places. You could like us on Facebook. You can follow us on Twitter. Nathan, what's our Twitter handle?
At the fear of God.
At the fear of God. You can follow us on Twitter. You can like us on Facebook. You can email us at thefearofgodpodcast@gmail.com. That's fearofgodpodcast@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Reed Lackey. And Nathan, where can they find you on Twitter?
At the Nathan Rouse.
All right. Well, we would love to hear from you, any and all of your thoughts on this. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks so much for having this conversation with us. Nathan, thank you for having this conversation with me.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Reed.
All right.
See you next week.
We'll see you next week, guys. Bye.